listening to Ken Hudnall. This is the Ken Hudnall Show. Coming to you from our studios right here in exciting El Paso, Texas. Gateway to the Old West and the most haunted city in the country. Well, today is Tuesday, May 6th. It's the 126th day of the year. Just 239 days remaining to the year's over with. And we get to go do it again. It is National Teacher Appreciation Day. It is National Foster Care Day, National Crepe Suzette Day, National Beverage Day, and let's not forget National Nurses Day. Oh yes, gotta remember the nurses. And it's National Tourist Appreciation Day, no homework day. Now, when I was in school, they ignored that. We got homework, well, we needed to do that. And let's see. I think that took care of that. Let's talk about what's in the news. Let's see. A illegally present Honduran national was arrested by ICE after they said local authorities dropped a series of charges, which included child abduction and home invasion. His name was Hiram Papadano Rodriguez, Fairfax, Virginia. He was arrested by ICE on the 2nd. He had been convicted of numerous crimes in Virginia and represented a calamitous hazard to Virginia residents. But he was undocumented and, he had a poor upbringing and a poor childhood and a few little things like home invasion. Why should we disturb him with that? The Kentucky sheriff allegedly killed a judge as surveillance footage shows an exchange between the sheriff and the judge moments before the sheriff shot him. A terminal colon cancer patient's been saved by a breakthrough treatment. A Minnesota woman got investigational immunotherapy during the last resort trial. And today she's healthy and cancer-free. She credits the drug claiming as saving her. J.D. Vance and other conservative blast Omar over resurfaced fearful of white man clip. That's genocidal language, they said. She did a 2018 Al Jazeera interview. Ilhan Omar, remember the squad in Congress? She was blasted over the comments she made regarding radicalization of white men. Let's see. A photographer of Trump getting shot has won the Pulitzer Prize for that photo. Danica McKellar, star of the Wonder Years, escaped Hollywood superficiality. Played Winnie Cooper opposite Fred Savage on the sitcom, which ran from 88 to 93. And she said after that show, she went to UCLA and got a degree in mathematics. Stopped acting for 4 years. After college, she went back to acting. I Love Boat, Even Stevens, and the 90s show called Working. I've seen her in a few movies. She's not bad. Well, the liberals, who made a hero out of Fetterman, post-stroke in 2022 have now turned on the pro-Israel senator after he did a New York Magazine report. They said just because he had a stroke doesn't mean he can't be a senator. Yeah, that's quite true. But now that he's not following party line, he has to go. He insists he's in good health in the interview, in the wake of a massive stroke he suffered in May of 2022. But staffers, past and present, say they no longer recognize the man they once knew. President Trump has blocked dangerous gain-of-function research. According to Dr. Mark Siegel, policies overseeing gain-of-function research have lacked adequate enforcement, transparency, and top-down oversight. In other words, nobody knew what they were doing. Well, conservatives have mocked the Democratic rhetoric about oligarchy as New York City. We remember a picture of Alex Soros and Uma Abedin goes viral. Well, Soros, you've got an oligarchy right there. Well, MSNBC has walked back their report that Kash Patel, the FBI chief, spends more time partying in nightclubs than he does doing his job. They said that's a misstatement. We haven't really verified that claim, but it sounded good when we said it. Well, President Trump's getting ready to reopen Alcatraz. I'm sure they'd find enough space to keep all the undocumented we can't send someplace else. Anti-Israel protesters have occupied a University of Washington building. They demand University of Washington divest all ties with Boeing because Boeing works with Israel. 30 people have been arrested. You know, did you go to university to learn, or did you go to protest and march and carry on like something had good sense? The federal judge has ordered North Carolina to certify Supreme Court election results with a Democrat leading. It's a Trump-appointed judge. It's ordered North Carolina to certify the nation's last undecided 2024 election. You know, again, one of God's anointed has decided what it's going to be. And let's see. The Israeli minister says Gaza will be entirely destroyed. Palestinians will be forced to go to other countries. Well, getting into our topic today, you know, there's a lot of mysteries on this planet. In fact, it appears that there's a great deal of evidence. It was a very advanced civilization here before the caveman, and something happened. There are stone monuments all over the planet, and there's no logical reason for them to have existed. For example, Vietnam, the Plain of Jars. I've talked about that before. It was the scene of several battles. It's a plateau surrounded by mountains, and it's called the Plain of Jars because it's covered with huge stone jars, well over 1,000. Some of them are 6 feet high. Some of them are big enough to hold 6 men. They're carved out of limestone and granite, and as far back as anybody can remember, they've been there. People who go to China don't even have any myths about why they're there. And you have to ask yourself, why would anybody devote so much time and effort to carving what is in effect a useless artifact, especially in such a remote and inaccessible place? Well, when the first Europeans landed in New England, they were shocked to find ancient stone towers, great man-made mounds of earth, and a lot of other strange structures. Many of these monuments, of course, were torn down and plowed under, but new discoveries continue to be made. In the 1930s, hundreds of miles of fine road, some of it 40 feet wide, found in the Southwest. Indians didn't have horse-drawn carts or wheels and no need for roads. They had no idea who built them. We've got dolmens or standing stones and massive Stonehenge-type structures that have been found scattered across the U.S., like their counterparts in Denmark, Great Britain, and France, built with mathematical precision. While the scientists believe they were used as astronomical computers. Now remember, American Indians were mostly nomadic hunters and lacked the advanced knowledge necessary to build such a thing. And further exploration showed that these ancient American builders also left a system of irrigation canals, carefully surveyed and laid out with their construction far beyond the abilities of the Indians. As the Europeans in North America drove the Indians back, they wantonly destroyed most of these ancient structures. Treasure hunters, of course, dug into the great mounds that were found, usually finding nothing but bones and pots and beads. Settlers knocked down the stone walls and the buildings to use the stones to build their cabins. Only a few hundred of the largest mounds were preserved, larger in Ohio and Mississippi. The mounds in Mexico met a similar fate. Christian church was built on the top of one of the largest ones. And the largest of all, which is larger and older than the Great Pyramid of Egypt, is the Step Pyramid in Cuiculoco, Mexico. Archaeologists have found that the below layers were covered with volcanic ash, which could be carbon dated. They estimated that the pyramid was built about 8,500 years ago. In other words, an advanced pyramid culture was hard at work in the Americas thousands of years before the Egyptian civilization began. But nobody knows anything about it. We know so little about that culture because archaeologists can't fit it into their theories. I've talked earlier about anything that doesn't fit in with the accepted theory gets relegated to the basement of the museums. Because if nobody can see it, nobody asks questions the archaeologists can't answer. They still maintain the myth the Indians migrated to this continent from Asia across the Bering Strait, even though there's no evidence to support that notion. And the Indians themselves say something entirely different. Cherokees claim they came from the east across the Atlantic Ocean. But the archaeologists say, oh, no, that couldn't be because there were no migrations of that type in those days. How do we know? Because we're the archaeologists. The Hopis and other southwestern tribes believe they came north from Central and South America. And scientists digging in New York State have even unearthed artifacts are obviously made by the Eskimos in New York. How did they wander so far from the tundra? Or perhaps they started there, driven northward by whoever built the mounds. Now, throughout the Mississippi and Ohio valleys are all kinds of ancient structures and traces of civilization that may have been comparable to the early civilization of the Indus Valley in India and the Nile Valley in Egypt. Stone cities dating back as far as 8,000 years ago are now being unearthed in the Mississippi Valley. You don't read a lot about it or hear a lot about it because the archaeologists don't really accept it because it doesn't fit into their pre-existing theories. Excavations in the upper layers of some of the so-called Indian mounds have turned up metal artifacts of iron and copper and alloy. American Indians had no knowledge of metallurgy and were limited to hammering axe heads out of meteoric iron. Such was so rare the axes are preserved for religious and ceremonial purposes. In spite of that, suits of copper armor, carefully and expertly worked from copper tubing, have been discovered in some of these mounds. Large numbers of skeletons with copper noses have been found. It appears that these noses were part of the burial preparations as delicate and complicated as the Egyptian mummification process. But we don't hear a lot of discussions about that because our teachers don't tell us about it, because it doesn't fit into their theories. The Great Lakes region, there's a huge network of ancient copper mines that have been found. Some of these mines were in use 2,000 years ago, and clearly from the size, must have required thousands of workers to extract and process that ore. Now, the Indian culture centered around flint arrowheads and animal skins, not mining and working with metal and oil. That was a useless liquid to the Indians. They used it only in some medicines and then only a very small quantity. First important modern oil well was discovered in Titusville, Pennsylvania in 1860. But later, very ancient shafts were discovered there, indicated that somebody had been digging for oil hundreds and even thousands of years before 1860. Tools and ladders and construction methods similar to those found in the old copper mines around Lake Superior were down there at the Titusville. Another ancient oil well was discovered in Enniskillen in Canada. And a worked lead mine was found on a farm outside of Lexington, Kentucky. So it appears at one point in time, North America was quite an industrialized continent. We don't know who did it, and we don't know how they did it. Now, going back to Indian myths and traditions, according to some of their myths, large parts of this continent were once inhabited by strange white men. The tribes around what are now the states of Kentucky and West Virginia claim that a bizarre group of what they call moon-eyed people once lived in those places. They had pale skins and large round eyes so sensitive to light they rarely ventured outside during the day. They lived in villages of stone houses which they guarded. The Indians learned to avoid them, and in fact the rich fertile hills of West Virginia were never settled by the Indians because it was the land of the moon-eyed people, and they were afraid of them. Now, modern armchair anthropologists, many of whom have never set foot in the field, have speculated the moon-eyed people may have been remnants of the famous lost colony. They're talking about the lost colony of in Virginia, the Roanoke Island colony that vanished into thin air, taking with it Virginia Dare, quite often referred to as the first American. He was born in 1587 in Roanoke Island. When the supply ships arrived from England after the Spanish Armada, they found the island deserted. The nearest Indian tribes weren't hostile, and they were as baffled by the mass disappearances were the Europeans. The only clue left behind was a word carved into a tree, Croatoan, which was the name of an island as well as the name of an Indian tribe. For 500 years, the Vikings maintained a settlement in Greenland, and a very large settlement, as a matter of fact. And then, like the Virginia colony, the entire population vanished, suddenly and mysteriously. A lot of theories. Many believe they immigrated en masse to North America because the Indians had legends about tall, blonde, pale-skinned gods. And some of the descriptions sound just like armor-wearing Vikings. Others of these tall, pale-skinned gods dressed in long, flowing robes. The Paiutes talk about a sacred plateau where these gods resided out west. And they were said to be equipped with magical rods that caused the skin to prickle like an electric shock and could induce paralysis. Sounds to me like a taser. In some legends, these gods are described as having the power of flight. According to the locals, they rode the night skies in great metal birds. Now, the Eskimos, who have a somewhat unusual resemblance to the ancient Olmecs of Central America, have long maintained they originally flew to the far north in metal birds. Like the Virginia colony and the Greenland settlement, the Olmecs vanished suddenly and mysteriously. We have no idea what happened to them. Aside from the moon-eyed people and the blonde gods, the Indians also had stories about having to deal with giants. Don't know where Indians believe that their tribe once lived in the west, but migrated eastward. In those days, according to their legends, the land east of the Mississippi, the city was inhabited by a race of giants who built mighty cities and fortifications. They were called the Allegheny. Both the Allegheny River and Allegheny Mountains are said to be named after them. Migrating Indians asked for permission to pass through the Allegheny country and were refused, so they went to war and eventually drove the giants out. Allegheny were said to have fled westward down the Ohio River and up the Mississippi and into Minnesota. And interestingly enough, excavations in Minnesota have discovered the bones of people 7 to 10 feet tall. They were found in some of the Minnesota mounds during the last century. But since we all know there were no giants, they were relegated to the basement of the museums. Natives of Ecuador in South America, a story about how a tribe of giants landed on their shores and reed rafts and tried to take over. From the knee down, they were the size of ordinary fair-sized man, and their eyes were the size of small plates. These giants slaughtered the Indians, raped the women, and finally, according to the stories, wiped out by some cosmic disaster. It was said a meteor struck their settlement and destroyed them all. So you have to ask yourself, are these giants the moon-eyed Allegheny from North America looking for a new home? Or is it just coincidence? Well, hard physical evidence found all across this continent indicates that an advanced culture thrived here long before the Indians made their alleged migration across the Bering Straits from Asia, because the mounds and the hinges and whatever you want to call them are similar to constructions found in Europe, Asia, and even remote Pacific islands. It would appear this culture was once worldwide, and it probably reached its zenith before the Ice Age 10,000 years ago, and then for whatever reason deteriorated in the wake of geological calamities. That early culture mapped the entire planet. Fragments of those maps were handed down over the centuries until Columbus got a hold of them. And the giants who once tossed huge blocks of stone around and built the puzzling monoliths that stand on every continent gradually reverted to a fierce, uncivilized state, driven by the requirements of survival. But of course, knowing all this couldn't be, our scientists and historians and archaeologists and what have you have never investigated the possibility there was a worldwide civilization. They just say, believe what we say, not what the evidence shows. Well, another overlooked theory has to do with UFOs. And from the mountains of northern Sweden to the hills of Tennessee, one of the most persistent rumors about UFOs is, for the last, 50 years, been enjoying a rebirth. The rumor first began in 1950, 3 years after Roswell, when ufologists started digging deeper into some of the stories. In the 1960s, the swept the world became an accepted truth to a lot of so-called ufologists. But its basic premise was so obscure and preposterous that a lot of folks rejected it and forgot it until it became a topic of discussion as a result of landings and contacts with alleged UFOs in 1973. This was the rumor that the UFO nauts were conducting biological experiments with human beings and trying to create an army of pseudo-humans by using the sperm and ovaries from unsuspecting Earthlings. I heard that discussed by a number of very sane people back when I used to talk at Roswell, before I became politically unacceptable to the people that took control. The number of reported contacts supporting the biological experiment theories is mounting rapidly. More and more investigators take an interest in what was initially a shunned part of the investigation. When investigators such as John Keel and others of his sort began to travel and speak and investigate stories, they collected a series of incredible reports from what appeared to be very sincere young men and women who claimed they had been abducted by UFOs and subjected to sexual experimentation. The males said their sex organs had been examined and special instruments had been used to extract semen from them. Females claimed they were either forcibly raped aboard the UFOs or instruments, usually described as long needles, inserted in their lower abdomens to remove substances from their ovaries. Now, until the 1990s, I'd only heard about 2 cases of this type, even though I've been following UFOs for 50 years now, 60 years. First of these 2 cases was the Vias Boas incident in Brazil in 1957. The young man said he was abducted and taken aboard a UFO and forced to have sex with a beautiful young lady. And then there was the Betty and Barney Hill abduction in 1962. However, until the late 60s, early 70s, after Keel and his cohorts collected all these stories, these 2 were talked about. Now, early investigators knew of such reported biological experiments and came up with a hybrid theory. Essentially, they're saying they're living among us today, people who are crossbreeds, half Earthlings and half space people. And these people are supposedly loyal to and controlled by the people from outer space. They're hybrids. And according to the theory, when the time comes, a large part of Earth's population is going to be hybrid. And a lot of women involved in close encounters with UFOs actually became pregnant shortly afterwards, although they don't have any memory of anything beyond seeing the UFO. Some are more a little astonished by their unexpected pregnancies. And a number of these ladies were followed, and the children they produced seemed exceptionally bright and frequently are involved in what you might refer to as a paranormal manifestation in their early years. Otherwise, they seem to be normal. In more than one case, it was observed that the child didn't look like either the man or the woman. Now, magazine book editors back in the 60s didn't want to touch it. It was too far out. Well, it turns out the theory of hybrid Earthlings is actually thousands of years old and is in fact an important part of occult, psychic, witchcraft, religious lore. Sexual intervention of supernatural entities is mentioned throughout the Bible. Look at the story of Abraham. And Christianity is founded on the belief that Mary was impregnated by an angel. Now, witches, I can't even read my own handwriting, are said to have intercourse with the devil. Witches believe any woman who's seduced by the devil has special powers after that, and given a very special respect. Numerous rites in black magic involve sex practices and sexual submission to the strange entities that materialize during the rites. There was a book called Oaspe, written by a New York dentist, said to have been written while in a trance back in 1880. And there are pages of pictures of special children with sober faces and deep black eyes that are supposedly hybrids put here by some unknown force. Several modern contactees have seen strange things happen in their own families. Their teenage daughters have staggered home claiming they were sexually assaulted by space beings. Their wives had vanished for hours or even days, returned suffering from amnesia, and they're pregnant. And several early contactees in the 1950s raised a so-called scientific ufologist with their tales that have been required to express their manhood, so to speak, on other planets or flying around in flying saucers. Now, the hybrid concept has a marked effect on the ufologists who accept it blindly. They actually become paranoid. They actually come to believe that hybrids have infiltrated the highest levels of government. In the 1960s, there was a major campaign that claimed that Robert McNamara, the defense secretary, was a hybrid. They knew his daughter-in-law, if he was anything like her. Certainly that's possible. Another theory that got its start back in the 60s and 70s was the clone theory. Now, a clone, of course, is an exact duplicate of a living organism. Theoretically, a clone can be manufactured from a single cell of your body, because every cell contains all the necessary biological information to construct a duplicate. Scientists around the world have been working on this process for years. Several modern contactees have talked about how they were taken aboard a UFO and a small sample of their skin was taken from their arm. If we had the technology to know how, we could use that small sample to create an exact duplicate of that person. Now, there's been stories of exact duplicates in a number of UFO tales told by reliable witnesses. In the occult, duplicates are called doppelgangers. And they're an age-old psychic phenomenon. In the 1960s, a doppelganger New York ufologist James Mosley turned up on a number of occasions. There's even a story that John Keel, a doppelganger, that appeared in several states from Long Island, New York to West Virginia, while he was actually someplace else. So are we dealing with clones, physical entities made out of solid flesh, or some type of psychic projection of some sort? And look at the MIBs, the men in black, usually travel in threes, and they look like triplets in many cases. Today, there are a number of people who have become convinced that they themselves really are hybrids. A number of contactees started life as orphans and never knew the identity of their true parents. Other people, like Lee Harvey Oswald, were seen in a number of places where they had never been. The Howard Menger, who was supposedly a hybrid, told stories about doppelgangers and teleportation and topics such as that. And of course, the scientific ufologist crucified him. Some contactees have lived in terror for years, fearing they're going to be whisked off to some other planet and bred like cattle. Now, have there been hybrids and clones living among us? Maybe. Never personally met one. But certainly it's possible. Maybe you lost a few minutes of time when you saw some weird object in the sky. Maybe there's another you out there someplace. Might ought to check. From hybrids and clones, let's talk about something else that I heard discussion of when I was in South America. Sleepers. Now, in the parlance of the intelligence community, sleepers as spies have been kept deliberately inactive for years while living in what amounts to deep cover. He or she remains on the payroll, but they don't do any actual spying until sometimes years after entering the intelligence service. The organization has a special need. A prime example of that, it came to light that an East German spy was sent to live in West Germany to carry out one specific mission. That mission was to train his own 5-year-old daughter and promote her into a job after she'd grown up as a secretary in the West German government office. Now that sounds far out and crazy, but it's this type of long-range planning and manipulation that's common in the shadowy world of intelligence and espionage. Sleepers are planted throughout our society. Some live and work in a community for 20 years or more, except if everybody's a teacher or a journalist or a businessman. But they get a monthly check from some agency in addition to their regular income. And they wait for the day when they might suddenly be called to break into a safe or take a photograph or maybe shoot somebody. One famous example was a young lady named Candy Jones. She was a famous model and the wife of Long John Neville, the New York radio talk show host. She was a different type of sleeper. Through hypnosis and drugs, the CIA had turned her into a deep cover spy. She was sent on missions in a trance state using a false name and false personality given her through brainwashing techniques. When she came back from the mission, she resumed her own life and personality and had no memory whatsoever about her escapades as a spy. She was a victim of an intelligence practice that had been in use for over 40 years at the time they did this to her. And sleepers are said to be common in the UFO phenomena. Like Candy Jones, ordinary people report being employed to carry out all kinds of missions, but don't have any memory of those missions when they return to their normal lives. Like all contactees, these sleepers have two important characteristics. They've got latent or active psychic abilities, and they're very suggestible, easily hypnotized. The false memories are planted in their minds to account for the periods in which they're being used. When a person has no memory of, say, a week, returns a vivid impression he or she's been taken to another planet. The human mind can be manipulated. Now, the sleeper first has to be hypnotized or drugged into a sleep trance. These trances can be induced through what are called triggers. And a trigger can take many forms. A specific pitch can cause the victim to lapse into a trance. These sounds can be transmitted even by telephone. Lights flashing in a specific pattern can do the job. Or maybe a simple word or command. When Dr. Benjamin Simon hypnotized Betty and Bernie Hill, he was later able to put them into a hypnotic state by simply saying, "Trance, Bernie." Ms. Neville often went into a spontaneous trance when she looked at herself in a mirror. Well, ordinarily a post-hypnotic suggestion will wear off in a few months or at most a few years. So once a person's undergone a contact experience, the hypnotic episodes have to be repeated periodically. That's why some participants who claim a close encounter often have repeated experiences spaced no more than 3 years apart. Unfortunately, the subsequent experiences are usually well hidden in the unconscious mind, and the witness doesn't have any conscious memory of them. Only the initial experience with this vivid surface confabulation, so to speak, be recalled at all by ordinary techniques. Mind of some recipients are too unstable to adjust to this kind of tampering. In some cases, a classic conflict develops between the conscious and the unconscious mind. Material hidden below the surface layer works its way through, and there's an overlap that leads to confusion, even partial insanity. That's why Betty and Bernie Hill sought out a psychiatrist to help them because they were bothered with horrible nightmares. Well, people who can make the adjustment without running into the problems of insanity and what have you can serve as sleepers in all kinds of ways. A mysterious phone call with beeping sounds can send them into a trance, during which they may write or mail a crack letter or carry out some other activity. And the frightening thing about all this is each new UFO wave brings more people under the hidden control of this phenomenon. We have no way to estimate how many sleepers there may be after, since 1947, 80 years of UFO sightings. No way of finding out the triggers in use. You can say almost every person who develops an obsession with UFOs has been subjected to some form of processing at some point in their life. But the question becomes, who's doing it? Or what's doing it? Is there some sinister organization plucking us off highways to hypnotize and drug us? Or invaders from outer space embarking on a worldwide campaign to brainwash us prior to landing or taking over our world? Well, years ago, the intelligence community discovered ways to produce the same effects through hypnosis and drugs and brainwashing techniques. But it's highly unlikely, if not altogether impossible, any nation could or would attempt to use these methods on an entire population. But, again, you never know. Well, one of the first serious UFO investigators in 1947 was a parapsychologist named Dr. Meade Lane. Did a newsletter called Round Robin, pioneer publication, eventually imitated by hundreds of others. Now, in those days, very few educated individuals dared to enter the flying saucer controversy. I can think of two other than Dr. Lane, and that was Dr. Hermann Oberth of Germany and astrophysicist Morris K. Jessup of the U.S. Both were hypnotized, so to speak, with the extraterrestrial explanation that while Lane took a more unpopular position, he saw links between UFOs and psychic manifestations. He labeled the UFO pilots Etherians and speculated they didn't come from some other planet, but were crossing over into our reality from some other dimension or space-time continuum. It's taken ufology. It took him over 50 years to catch up with his way of thinking. Now, he witnessed the UFO mysterious vanishing act in the early years and came up with two words, MAT and DMAT, for materialization and dematerialization. He used them to describe their behavior. And next to the famous falling leaf motion that was talked about by a number of witnesses, this is the most frequently reported action of these aerial objects. Back a number of years later, photographers equipped with infrared lenses and film added to the puzzle by successfully photographing aerial objects that were not visible to the naked eye. Apparently, the disappearing act really consisted of an ability to traverse the visible spectrum of light, and pass from the invisible field of infrared at one extreme to the invisible area of ultraviolet at the other extreme. It's been well established now in thousands of sightings, UFOs emit both infrared rays, heat, and ultraviolet rays that can burn the skin and eyes. But passing through the visible spectrum is not really an interdimensional action. It's more likely that some UFOs are masses of plastic energy that are normally invisible to us, but when conditions are just right, alter their frequencies and enter the visible spectrum. In other words, they may always be present in the skies, but only be seen at certain points in time. Now, a few years ago, Alan Greenfield of Atlanta, Georgia, revived Lane's findings by coming up with the theory of alternate realities. He wondered if UFOs could be coming to us from another reality very similar to our own. Maybe they figured out a system of crossing some mysterious barrier of time and space to visit us. Didn't come from a distant planet, but in a sense, we're our next door neighbors, even though we're not fully aware of their existence. Some of the UFO contactees also spoke about time travelers and offered cryptic explanations for UFOs' wild talents. Others had close experiences with the objects and entities but didn't claim direct contact, offered information that seemed to indicate that while the flying saucer occupants looked human or lacked free will or almost robotic-like, when they spoke, they seemed to recite like a computer. They rarely revealed any human-like emotions and seemed more like confused ghosts. Human-like, but in essence, very inhuman. And if they came from a reality like our own, it must be a rather grim place, to be perfectly frank. The best clue about their place of origin lies in the definitely unearthly behavior of the objects themselves. I mean, flying saucers don't actually fly. They're not supported by the air in our atmosphere. Whenever they defy all our laws of motion, they levitate. They're not disturbed by turbulent air as airplanes are, and they've often been seen making right-angle turns at high speed, demonstrating their disassociation from normal inertia and gravity forces. Of course, if they hail from another dimension or an alternate reality, their actions may be governed by an entirely different set of natural laws. Forces that bind us to Earth aren't necessarily uniform throughout the universe. If most UFOs are actually masses of energy with the ability to tune their frequencies up and down the electromagnetic scale, they not only alter their color on the visible spectrum, but they could change their size and shapes as well. A reddish cigar-shaped object seen at one point could become the silvery saucer-shaped object seen a few miles away. And if the saucer could land and discharge a tall spectral passenger, it would actually be an integral part of the saucer itself. The mass would possess intelligence, not the robot. In fact, the witnesses have said to themselves, I don't know why, but I had the feeling the saucer itself was alive. Maybe that was true. So is there an alternate reality populated with living masses of energy, like intelligent lightning bolts? Well, there's evidence supporting it and evidence denying it, just like everything else about UFOs. Well, from seances to science, Dr. Lane's method of communicating with the aliens was simple but unscientific. He spoke to them through trance mediums, and transcripts of some of these amazing seances are still available. This came to be called channeling in the 80s and 90s. And as a parapsychologist, Lane was familiar with the weird phenomena of materialization, and it occurred to him UFOs were following the unnatural laws of psychic phenomena. Their appearance and disappearance has been equated to the materialization of ghostly entities in the seance room. And spiritualism was all the rage in the last half of the 19th century, and materialization was almost commonplace. Entities would slowly appear in dimly lit rooms and perform physical acts, shake hands with the sitters, even leave fingerprints and trays of wax. And then they'd mysteriously fade into thin air. And they came in all sizes and shapes. The most common type was an Indian-like figure with high cheekbones and real eyes. Often these characters wore some kind of metal headpiece. People are still describing these beings, except they no longer pop up in the seance room. They come out of glistening UFOs. Ray Stanford, a psychic, and twin brother, Dr. Rex Stanford, a well-known psychiatrist, claims to have been present the materialization of such an entity. The most famous of all the witnesses to visualization is Sir William Crookes, an inventor. He ranked with Edison and Einstein and developed the Crookes tube for one of the X-ray tube, an important step toward the perfection of modern TV. He was also one of the first men of science to become interested in psychic phenomena and made many important contributions to the infinite science of parapsychology. According to what Crookes wrote, he'd seen a solid, self-luminous body the size and nearly the shape of a turkey's egg floating noiselessly about the room. He said, I've had questions answered by the flashes of a bright light a desired number of times in front of my face. In the light, I've seen a luminous cloud hover over the heliotrope on the side table, break a sprig off, and carry the sprig to a lady. Now, he wasn't describing UFOs. He was writing about things materialized in a seance room. His most famous experiments where he studied the mysterious Katie, a female entity who appeared no less than 45 times and permitted the scientists to touch her and even to give her a medical examination. She only appeared after a lady medium collapsed in a trance. Now, Katie was taller than the medium and different in a number of other ways. And so William naturally explored every possibility for trickery, but couldn't find any explanation for the phenomena. Countless modern UFO cases, we've got examples of mediumship. One or more of the witnesses collapses before or during the materialization of a UFO or entity. Usually investigators regard this as a reaction to the smell, which is often terrible, or energies radiating from the object. But since these events follow the same course as comparable psychic manifestations, it's more probable that the collapse of the witness contributes directly to the UFO materialization. Parapsychologists have long suspected that occult forces need to draw on energy from this reality in order to manifest. The mediums apparently supply the energy. There are innumerable cases in which cows and horses and dogs and cats may have been the energy source. Barney Hill, the best known of all modern contactees, stepped into a field with a pair of binoculars to look at an alien object. Later on, he found the strap on the binoculars was broken, but he had no idea how that happened because he was entranced. Barely conscious throughout the interruption in his interrupted journey, which is the story of their contact with UFOs. But his wife, Betty, was apparently awake throughout the entire incident. Pascagoula, Mississippi incident in 1973, Calvin Parker was unconscious while Charles Hickson was only paralyzed. Both men were said to be taken on board a UFO and examined by necklace beings with crab-like claws. Apparently, Parker was the medium in this particular case. If you sift through the UFO literature, you find a lot of comparable cases, such as the Flatwood, West Virginia monster story of 1952. Young National Guardsmen passed out in the presence of that weird creature. Need for energy can also explain why so many luminous UFOs have been seen hovering around power lines and antenna radio transmitters. Ivan Sanderson studied cases of this sort and wondered, are we providing a free lunch for energy forms from space? Brinsley Lepore Trench and Gordon Crichton of England, Dr. Jacques Vallée and Amin Michel of France, and most of the leading ufologists around the world have abandoned the extraterrestrial or interplanetary theory. I regard alternate reality or interdimensional concept as a more valid explanation for the things that continue to haunt our skies. Several important parapsychologists such as Dr. Julie Eisenbud and Dr. Nicole Schwartz have entered into UFO investigation. Ideas that once seemed laughable are now being carefully considered by a generation of ufologists. The hardware boys who believe UFOs are manufactured machines from another planet had over 40 or 50 years to prove their case, and they failed. To me, Lane's Ethereans are beginning to seem more real than the Martians and Venusians of yesterday's ufology. Proving they came from an alien space-time continuum populated by living energy will be just as difficult as proving they came from another planet with a superior technology. No matter which way you look at it, or it's going to be a free lunch counter for a long time to come. Well, the story of Antonio Villas-Boas of Brazil has become very well known. 1957, I talked about this earlier, he was allegedly taken aboard a UFO and introduced to a blonde space lady with whom he had sexual intercourse. Before his X-rated adventure began, the man on board the object pulled off his clothes and covered him with a wet sponge. He said the liquid was as clear as water, quite thick and without smell. He said, I thought it was some kind of oil, but I was wrong. I stunned him to become greasy, one more time, greasy or oily. Now, the Greeks and the Romans believed the gods used ambrosia as an ointment when they bathed. Out of ancient cultures, human sacrifices were anointed with oil before their hearts were ripped out. And this practice overlapped into Christianity. Christ's followers loved him with an expensive oil before he was crucified. In fact, the very name Christ comes from the Greek Christos, which means the anointed one. His real name was Yehoshua, or Joshua. The name Jesus Christ wouldn't apply until several hundred years after his death. It's intriguing Antonio Villas-Boas underwent an ancient anointing ceremony on board the spaceship in Brazil. Now, Larry Foreman of California didn't receive a cosmic bath, but during a series of UFO contacts near Socorro, New Mexico in the 1960s, claims to have tasted ambrosia. He said to him it's some kind of punch, berry of some kind. The story includes stone walls that weren't there and a variety of obvious hallucinations common to the victims of enchantment. May of 1969, a Brazilian soldier named Jose Antonio won a remarkable experience when he was kidnapped by a group of tiny humanoids and transported to a cavern-like room of stone. There, his captors offered him a drink from a stone cube with a pyramid-shaped cavity in the center. It was a dark green liquid with a bitter taste. But he said he felt a lot better after drinking it. And Woodrow Derenberger, a contact in West Virginia, also felt better after he drank a liquid given him by an alleged ufonaut in 1967. He'd been suffering a stomach ailment, and the outer space potion cleared it right up. And on that note, we come to the end of today's show. We'll be back tomorrow and talk more about the world we haven't seen. Till then, this is Ken Hudnall for the Ken Hudnall Show saying have a truly great evening.